Hey, good Monday, everybody. It's your weather buddy, Craig. And we are talking about, I think, an appropriate topic today on the Weather Academy here on YourErie.com. So June 1st today. Happy June. So June 1st marks the official start of hurricane season. And we're going to talk about a global oscillation today and kind of how that relates to the tropics. And it's something that we look at regularly as meteorologists, especially for a seasonal forecast. Now, first things first, when we talk about seasonal forecasts, you're talking about months and months in advance. They're not very accurate, okay? We struggle with the 7-day forecast, so let's try and predict the next, 3 months. But we're going to talk about something called ENSO today, and that is an acronym. So what exactly is ENSO and how does it work when it comes to the weather? Believe it or not, this is something that we have to look at in the equatorial Pacific Ocean. How does that relate to weather here and around the globe for that matter? This is just one of many global oscillations that we look at. So ENSO is the big one that we look at, and you've heard a lot about ENSO, believe it or not, when it comes to El Nino and La Nina. So let's talk about what ENSO is and what it stands for. The E stands for El Nino, S Southern, O oscillation. So El Nino, Southern oscillation. And again, we have to look at the equatorial Pacific for this global oscillation because it does alter the jet stream flow around the globe. And again, this is just one of many global oscillations that we look at. So you've heard about El Nino, you've heard about La Nina. And to put it into the simplest terms for you, El Nino is the baby boy, La Nina is the baby girl. And this ideology was kind of adopted by Peruvian fishermen. The coming of El Nino, the coming of the baby boy. And it also kind of has some relationship with the birth of Christ, too. So that's El Nino and La Nina in the simplest terms. But what about scientifically? What are these things? How do they work? What does it mean when we're in an El Nino year or a La Nina year? Because these occur at irregular intervals. And we're going to kind of delve into both of these and how they impact the weather, not just here in Northwest Pennsylvania, but across the globe, and especially when it comes to tropics, being that it is June 1st and the hurricane season officially underway now. All right, so let's dive into this a little bit more. So El Nino, what is it? Well, it is a significant increase in sea surface temperature over the eastern and central Pacific Ocean that occurs at irregular intervals every 2 to 7-ish years. Now, keep in mind it's irregular, so it's not like every 2 years El Nino shows up or every 4 years El Nino shows up. It's kind of irregular. But that warming of the sea surface temperatures alters the way the jet stream pattern works across the globe, and jet stream is what drives weather here at the surface. So how that jet stream behaves across the globe ultimately determines what kind of weather that you and me deal with, or you and I guess that would be the proper way to say that. So that's El Nino, significant increase in sea surface temperature. What do you think La Nina is? The baby girl, right? Well, if El Nino is the warming, La Nina is the opposite of El Nino. So when we're in a La Nina, it is the positive or cold phase of El Nino, the opposite. And it's often associated with cooler than average sea surface temperatures in the central and eastern Pacific. So you have warming, which is the El Nino, and then you have the cooler side of the envelope, which is La Nina. And again, these both have significant impacts on the weather, not just here in Northwest Pennsylvania, but across the globe. How could something so far away have an impact on weather? Well, if you remember back to last Friday when we were talking about weather and bacteria and condensation nuclei, It's all kind of connected in a way. So let's delve into this a little bit more. So you might be asking, well, what happens if there's not an El Nino and La Nina or La Nina? That happens. We in the weather biz like to call that La Nada. Means there's no real signal of what's going on in the equatorial Pacific. But this is an example of what an El Nino looks like. So to get your bearings, see the United States in the top right, South America off to the right, and then off to the left of the screen you have Southeast Asia and Australia and the equator. See that orange blob, that kind of elongated orange area? That is significant warming at the equatorial Pacific. That is an example of El Nino. So let's break it down and we'll talk about what a neutral ENSO is. A neutral El Nino Southern Oscillation has to do with the trade winds. Now you can see here from this graphic, the warmer water at the equator kind of drifts westward back towards Southeast Asia. You can see a little bit of cooler water off the coast of South America. Nothing crazy. So that's kind of what a neutral ENSO is. There's really not much happening out there, which makes forecasting very tricky when it comes to trying to predict seasonal forecasts. Like, we often get questions, what's the winter going to be like? What's the summer going to be like? Well, the first place we usually look is to ENSO. And if there's nothing going on, well, you know, that kind of makes the forecast even more difficult than it already is. So what about when the ENSO is in El Nino? So that's when warmer water is pushed back to the east towards South America. You see that orange area kind of filtering back towards South America there, banking up against the coast there of South America and Central America. And then if you look at the United States, you can see a little blob there that says a warmer winter. That's typically the case in an El Nino winter. So that's when you have the significant warming at the equator and that water starts to bank up on the coast. The warmer water starts to bank up near the coast of South America. And that has implications for our weather here in the Great Lakes. So what about La Nina? Obviously, it's the opposite, the cooler temperatures, cooler sea surface temperatures at the equatorial Pacific. Now this, when we get into a La Nina winter, the trade winds are increased, okay? So kind of blowing the water in the opposite direction. That warmer water is blowing all the way west towards Australia and Southeast Asia. Now, that causes problems in that part of the world, but for us here, it's just kind of a cool, wet type winter. The desert Southwest usually experiences dry and warmer weather. But you can see all of that colder water now banking up against the coast of South America, Central America, even up into the Baja, California, and Mexico there. So that's what a La Nina looks like. So the warmer water is blown to the west, way out towards Southeast Asia, which has implications on their weather. More water, or more warm water, means more moisture, more evaporation, okay? That leads to more cloud cover and showers and thunderstorms. And that part of the world in Australia, especially after the recent wildfires in Australia, you have the burn scars, that can lead to flooding potential, so big problems in a La Nina winter across Southeast Asia. As we take a look now at the trade winds, now these are important. When we're in a neutral ENSO, trade winds are kind of, you know, and what you're seeing here, this diagram. Notice the ocean. On the right-hand side would be the South American coast. On the left-hand side of your screen, that would be Southeast Asia. And you notice the water temperature is pretty even keel. There's not a lot of warm, not a lot of cold. You see the trade winds just kind of drifting across the ocean. It is a little bit warmer as you make your way towards Southeast Asia in a neutral phase, and you can get more showers and storms to develop over that part of the world. And there's some weak upwelling near the South American coast. So that is kind of what a neutral phase looks like. So there's really no significant changes in the sea surface temperatures, which obviously the sun heats the sea surface temperature. And you can see the really cold air, or really cold water rather, the deep cold water at the bottom of the ocean. There's really not a lot of upwelling, not much change. As we look at the trade winds in an El Nino winter, well, now you see some changes, right? Stronger westerly winds blowing from that direction off the coast of Southeast Asia. And then you have weaker trade winds. So as those westerly winds blow across the Pacific, they encounter those weak trade winds. So it's really kind of like a tug of war between the two. But because the trade winds are weaker, you can see that convection, the clouds, the showers are pushed out into the central Pacific and even into the eastern Pacific Ocean. You get some weak upwelling near South America, and the warmer water may not make its way as far west in the Pacific as it would if it were a neutral phase because of those westerly winds being a little bit stronger. So you get some weak upwelling, some weak when the ocean kind of turns over, it kind of tends to bring up that colder water to the surface. But when there's weak upwelling, you don't get as much of that colder water to come to the surface. So that's why in an El Nino year, the sea surface temperatures are statistically warmer. As we look at La Nina, strong trade winds across all the Pacific Ocean, okay? And you can see how that warm water is blown all the way west towards Southeast Asia, and that's where you get those showers and storms which could lead to flooding and mudslides and all of that stuff over that part of the world. When those winds are so strong, it takes all of that warm water that's out there in the equatorial Pacific and blows it to the west towards Southeast Asia. Notice that little line there too in the center of your screen. It's in white there. It's called the thermocline. And what a thermocline is it kind of is the demarcation line. It's the gradient between really cold water and the warmer water on the surface of the ocean. Remember, kind of tying this into weather, warm air, lighter, less dense, so it rises. Cold air, heavier, dense, so it sinks. Same kind of idea on the ocean. So that layer of warm water on the ocean, right at the top, with the colder water deep down into the ocean. But during a La Nina year, with the stronger trade winds blowing across the ocean, it kind of overturns the ocean there. And you can get a lot more of that strong upwelling, a lot more of that colder water to come to the surface near the coast of South America. So that's what it looks like in a La Nina. The trade winds look like in a La Nina year. Strong trade winds, all the showers and storms, all the warm water blowing to the western side in the Pacific Ocean. All right, so let's talk about the tropics during El Nino versus a La Nina year. And you can come back to me on camera briefly. So June 1st marks the beginning of hurricane season. We've already had two, right, Tom? Two? Yes. Two. And we're monitoring an area in the Gulf of Mexico right now that may develop into the third tropical system of the year. So June 1st all the way through November is what is considered to be the Atlantic hurricane season. And that's typically when you start to see more activity build in the tropics. So here we are, June 1st, hurricane season officially underway. Already have had two tropical systems that have formed outside of hurricane season, which can happen. But how does this ENSO thingy, this El Nino Southern Oscillation, this global pattern affect the tropics? Well, it's interesting. So take a look at this. So the tropics during El Nino and La Nina. In an El Nino year, it is often the case where you have more hurricanes in the eastern Pacific due to weak vertical wind shear. What is vertical wind shear? Well, as you go up in altitude in the atmosphere, the winds change direction with height, okay? So when a hurricane encounters wind shear, it gets torn apart. It gets ripped apart by that wind shear. Well, due to weaker vertical wind shear in an El Nino year over the eastern Pacific, that's where you tend to see an active hurricane season. There are fewer hurricanes in the Atlantic due to strong vertical wind shear because the winds out over the Caribbean and the Atlantic basin, that wind shear as you go up is much more notable, so it's more likely to kind of rip these tropical systems apart. Opposite of that, La Nina. So we talked about El Nino, baby boy, La Nina, baby girl. Opposite, really, fewer hurricanes in the eastern Pacific due to stronger vertical wind shear, and there are more hurricanes in the Atlantic due to the weaker vertical wind shear and the warmer ocean water. So that's a look at tropics during the El Nino, kind of a couple of bullet points when you hear El Nino and La Nina and how that might tie into the tropics. So let's come back to me here, and we'll talk real briefly before we wrap up about wind shear and hurricanes. So as I mentioned, as you go up in the atmosphere, okay, the winds go different direction with height. And you have a hurricane coming across the Atlantic Ocean, and if it encounters wind shear in the atmosphere, that hurricane can't really sustain itself, okay? Hurricanes are massive storms. They breathe very well, especially if the ocean water is very warm and there's no vertical wind shear, nothing to shear it apart, nothing to tear it apart. That's typically when you can get a very healthy tropical system to develop. A couple of storms that come to mind, Irma a couple of years ago. Katrina was one of those. I'm trying to think off the, I think Maria, I believe, was a storm that didn't really have any impacts from vertical wind shear. So for the Atlantic, and we don't really get hurricanes here in Northwest PA, we can get remnants from them, but for our purposes in the Atlantic, if there is a La Nina taking place in the equatorial Pacific, that's when our kind of radar beams go up, and we kind of keep an eye, a real close watch on the tropics in the Atlantic basin especially. So I just thought that was kind of an appropriate topic to discuss, being that, you know, today, first day of hurricane season, and just kind of give you a little insight on how everything's kind of connected in weather across the globe with these oscillations. You have the ENSO, you have the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, the North Atlantic Oscillation, there's a list of them, and those all kind of work together in tandem to kind of alter the way the jet stream flows across the United States and across the world for that matter. And obviously, like I said at the beginning, jet stream is what drives weather here at the surface. So whatever's happening in the Pacific eventually will make its way around the globe and impact us here in Northwest PA. Pretty cool when you think about it, actually, how everything's all kind of connected. So hope that gave you a little bit of insight on what ENSO is, El Nino Southern Oscillation, when we talk about El Nino and La Nina, terms I'm sure you have heard. And that's how they kind of work. You know, it has to do with the sea surface temperatures in the equatorial Pacific that impact the weather patterns all across the globe, even way up here in Northwest PA. That's the Weather Academy for today. Hey, thanks for joining us. We'll be back on, let's see, Wednesday. Tom DeVecchio has one more history lesson for you. And then we're going to discuss, I believe, on Friday, weather and time zones, and how that is important when it comes to forecasting weather. So we hope you join us then. Until then, enjoy, have a good one, and we will see you next time here on YourErie.com for the Weather Academy. I'm meteorologist Craig Flint. See ya.